Have you ever thought about how we almost never talk about smells when we talk about the history of ancient societies? No? Well, you will today. I'm Eric Malikyte, and today on ScienceGet, we'll be talking about how ancient smells contribute, or rather don't contribute, to our understanding of the distant past. It's interesting to think about how we use our olfactory senses when interacting with our world. We use sight and sound to interact with most media, and that's pretty much it. Or at least that's what stood the test of time so far. In a somewhat related sense, this is primarily how we interact with the distant past. We may use advanced technology to analyze ancient artifacts in order to paint a more accurate picture of the past, but in the end, we must experience archaeological artifacts with our senses, and then we must imagine how that artifact changes our perception of the ancient world. And archaeologists can see, touch, and in some cases, smell an artifact. What is unusual, however, is for an artifact to release, how do I put this? Extinct smells. Yes, you heard that right. Smells that human beings in the ancient world once experienced but have been lost to the sands of time. Before we continue with the video today, I just want you all to know that I've created a brand new channel. It's an analog horror channel focused on Lovecraftian horror, so if you dig that sort of thing and you need a good scare, check it out. The link is in the pinned comment. Similar to how archaeologists have been unable to draw much interest in recreating sounds that people might have heard in the ancient past, like those scientists that engineered what people might have heard at Stonehenge thousands of years ago, so too have they largely been unable to draw much interest to the idea of resurrecting ancient smells. But the idea is catching on, as a recent article at sciencenews.org elaborates on, suggesting that some archaeologists are going through the immense trouble of isolating molecules that would have contributed to a particular odor when a given artifact was new, or how some are attempting to replicate ancient Egyptian perfume recipes. The whole idea is to figure out how ancient peoples came to understand how they interpreted their world through all of their senses, not just sight. And this is where technology obviously plays a huge role. This is going to sound really gross, so I apologize in advance. Archaeologists are now implementing biomolecular techniques that are essentially able to identify individual molecules from fragrances. And no, I don't just mean from perfume. No. We're talking about molecules from ancient garbage pits, barf, cooking pots, less barf, and even ancient crusty tartar on mummified teeth, maximum barf. After a molecule is identified, the archaeologist is then able to ascertain what the ancient smell was composed of and then replicate it. Just think about that for a second, and try not to get grossed out from the idea of replicating how ancient tartar buildup on a tooth might smell. Seriously. But what the hell is a smellscape? Well, the first question you have to ask yourself is, how would you imagine life in, say, an ancient Egyptian city? It's interesting to think about this because ultimately, most of the time we can only imagine the visual component of what life would have been like back then. A smellscape is an archaeological attempt at getting a much larger picture of how that city we're imagining might have smelled to most of its visitors and denizens. While identifying molecules that made up a particular fragrance is an important tool in the modern odor-concerned archaeologist's tool belt, it's only a fraction of the puzzle that we're trying to put together. Really, what's needed to figure out what the whole smell-o-vision-esque picture might look like is really a combination of different sources. For example, some archaeologists are combing ancient written text for any hint of what that world might have smelled like. References like this have allowed archaeologists like Egyptologist Dora Goldsmith of Freie University Berlin to reconstruct what a royal palace in Egypt might have smelled like, going so far as to describe how the habit of rulers to cake on perfume would have choked out any other hints of what the rest of the court might have smelled like. Look, hygiene in the distant past was a whole thing. People were just gross, okay? In direct contrast to that whole mental image is how aspiring scribes in their total devotion to learning would abstain from any of those aforementioned perfumes and other pleasant smelling odors. And it's worth it to note that the author of the article that this video script is based on has one of the best punny responses to what those aspiring scribes were called. One ancient source described aspiring scribes as quote-unquote stinking bulls. That name speaks and reeks for itself. Bruce Bauer. Great job, Bruce Bauer. Great job. I chuckled and threw up in my mouth a little bit. Just figuring out how the ancient world smelled is not enough. How we interpret the smells from the ancient world is probably totally different from how ancient peoples related to them. The way we experience smell has a massive impact on how we experience our world, and the same would have been true for ancient peoples. Hell, interestingly enough, we have scientific proof that our memories can be instantaneously triggered by certain smells. And while what we perceive today as being smells that are unpleasant or vice versa, we can't just assume that that was the case in the past. This is where archaeological evidence comes in. Ramses VI, for example, who the article references in the first paragraph, thought it was his mission to get rid of the typical smells that plagued the swamps of ancient Egypt when he became king. But the why of that is thought to have come from an ancient hymn that inspired this in him. And thanks to archaeologists like Goldsmith, we have a pretty good idea what smells likely influenced that hymn. The work is just beginning though, and unfortunately this is an area that has been virtually untouched until recently. Goldsmith suggests that understanding how ancient worlds smelled is a vital contextual clue to what the ancient world was really like. That's all I've got for you today, so if you dug this video, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and like, comment, super thanks, subscribe, and share this with someone who likes the smell of old books. And be sure to check out my new project. It's called The Office of Extra-Dimensional Intelligence, and it's an analog horror series that is sure to leave you deeply unsettled. And hey, check out all those wonderful names. Thank you, patrons. I'm Eric Malikyte, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.